This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because of course this has enormous implications. So as we go through this opinion now with our team, another outstanding question.
All right, people, welcome to DR John Podcast. So what just happened, guys? When the Supreme Court vaporized the foundation of his economic agenda, Trump didn't respond like a statesman. He exploded. He called the court a disgrace, its justices fools and lapdogs, and accused them of being swayed by foreign interests. This wasn't legal criticism.
Is what now happens to all that revenue that had been collected. This is something that it really wasn't clear from the arguments what they would say about that, if they're going to lay out a plan. So we will continue to go through this, but this is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump before this conservative court.
This is, Paula, a major slap at the President of the United States, who has made a major effort over these many, many months to impose all of these tariffs. And just to look at some of the background I have here, over these many months, the administration has collected $150 billion in these tariffs. So what happens to that money? Do they have to refund that money to the firms, to the people who paid for those tariffs?
That's one of the big questions that came up at arguments, and it's something that we're looking through now in this opinion. The top line is that these are illegal, that the president cannot rely on this 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs.
It was a declaration of war on judicial independence from a man who just discovered that lifetime appointments don't come with lifetime loyalty. He stacked that court. He thought he owned it, and it ruled against him anyway. This was the fallout from the seismic 6-3 decision that struck down a staggering mountain of tariffs, a sum so vast it reshaped the flow of global commerce as an unconstitutional overreach of executive power.
Without authorization from Congress, because this question is really about the extent of presidential power. And we know in both his terms in office, President Trump has really worked at the edges of what has largely been recognized as executive authority. But in these arguments back in November, they went on for 2.5 hours. It was clear that the justices were skeptical that President Trump could rely on this vague federal law to impose global tariffs. Now, they did appear to likely be willing to decide that these were illegal, but what is not clear, and we haven't gotten to this part of the opinion, is what happens to all that revenue that has been collected by the government. And President Trump has said himself that this is, this is a massive decision for him. So we're waiting for reaction, both from the Justice Department that argued this on his behalf and also from the White House. But we're going to keep going through this, Wolf, to try to see if the justices laid out any plan for what happens to that revenue.
The court, led by the pen of the Chief Justice, invoked a legal principle designed specifically to rein in the kind of sweeping, unilateral action that treats the legislative branch as a decorative afterthought. And here is the twist that turned the president's rage from mere anger into a deeply personal sense of betrayal. 2 of the 6 votes to kill his signature economic policy came from the very jurists. All
right, Paula, stand by. I know you're going to be reading all these the opinions and everything. I want to get back to you, but I want to bring in our senior legal analyst, Ellie Honig, right now. Ellie, as I said, this is a huge setback for the President of the United States, and this has been a traditionally conservative Supreme Court, but they ruled that all of these tariffs that Trump has imposed over these many months are illegal. It's a big deal.
Well, Wolf, it's a monumental ruling, and the bottom line is that the tariffs Donald Trump announced back in April on Liberation Day are gone. They have been ruled illegal by this U.S. Supreme Court. An interesting array of justices here. In the majority, ruling that the tariffs are illegal is Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 3 conservatives who teamed up with the 3 liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, to rule these tariffs unconstitutional. The dissenters are Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh. And the basis for the ruling is this. Congress not the president, Congress typically holds the tariff power. Now, Congress passed this law back in 1977 called the International Economic Emergencies Act. And Donald Trump tried to use that law to say, well, I'm declaring an international economic emergency.
He personally elevated to the bench the people he put in those robes, the people he expected to have his back when the big cases came calling. In his world, loyalty is the only currency that matters, and in the biggest trade negotiation of his political life, he got shorted. The subsequent meltdown was broadcast in real time, from the impromptu, off-script harangues in the briefing room to the closed-door fundraising dinners weeks later. The president could not let it go.
Therefore, I'm imposing tariffs. But the majority here said, no, that law does not authorize you to impose tariffs, and no, there is not a valid international economic emergency here. So the end result, and we are still going through this, but the end result is that Donald Trump's tariffs have been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. But really important point I want to make, Donald Trump has said, various White House officials have said, if he loses on this basis, he will try to re-implement other tariffs through other laws, which he can try to do. However, those other laws are much more restrictive. They would not allow him to apply the type of sweeping, massive, across the globe tariffs that he tried to impose here, but have now been struck down. Look, Donald Trump said these tariffs are the single most important thing he has done in his presidency. He said that, and now they've been struck down by the court.
So you're right. The administration has made clear that if the court strikes this down, that they'll look at other tariff authorities to use.
He quantified the betrayal in dollar signs, accusing his own appointees of personally costing the nation hundreds of billions. And in the same breath that he was vowing to circumvent the ruling with a new, even more aggressive layer of blanket tariffs, he was setting the stage for the next act of this high-stakes constitutional drama, a drama that will inevitably end up right back in the courtroom of the same lapdog he just finished insulting. Let us transport ourselves directly into the aftermath of the ruling's release.
But bottom line here, Ellie, how big of a mess does this ruling create, given the fact that the administration says it has already received $150 billion in revenue, largely paid for by American businesses? Do they get a refund? What happens now?
Yeah, so it's hard to think of a case that has broader implications politically and legally and economically than this one. I know a lot of people are watching for this one. We don't yet have the answer. This was a question that came up during the oral argument. Amy Coney Barrett in particular asked the lawyers, well, what do we do with the $100+ billion that have already been paid by American importers, by American manufacturers? We're going to look carefully at this. I know Paul is reading this very carefully, but that's a huge question. Will there be some sort of mass refund program? Will the court rule that the tariffs are dead from here on out, but there are no repayments? We will let you know as soon as we get an answer to that one.
All right. As you noted, Paula has been reading through the opinion. I want to go back to Paula Reed because we know that 3 conservatives sided with the liberals on the court. And you have a quote from one of those conservatives, right, Paula?
That's right. Well, this is Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion where the court agreed 6-3.
The decision landed like a bunker buster on the West Wing. The legal justification was airtight and, for the president, utterly infuriating. The majority opinion, anchored in the doctrine that says massive shifts in national policy require a clear, explicit green light from the people's elected representatives rather than a vague nod from a decades-old emergency statute, was a masterclass in judicial restraint.
That President Trump's tariffs exceed his power under the law. He wrote, quote, "The president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it." And we knew that the Chief Justice would be a key vote after what we saw at arguments. Now, we are still going through this. I want to show you, this is about a third of the opinion. It's 170 pages long. This is just a fraction of it. Wow. So we're going through it very carefully to try to understand what, if anything, the court said about what happens to all that revenue the government has already collected. I know that's a big question right now. We are carefully going through this to see if they laid out a plan, if this goes back to the lower courts. That's what we're working to figure out right now.
The court essentially told the executive branch, you do not get to rewrite the rules of global trade by flicking a switch in the Oval Office. That power resides down the street in the Capitol. The coalition that delivered this verdict was a nightmare scenario for a man who sees the world in terms of allies and enemies. It was a mix of the liberal wing and two conservatives who refused to bend the text of the law to accommodate the political whims of the moment.
And a quick question from me, Paula. Do the tariffs immediately go away as of right now, or does it take a few days or at least maybe a few weeks for them to be removed?
Well, they've been declared by the Supreme Court to be illegal. So we're going through to see if they laid out some sort of plan. But as of right now, people should not have to pay a tariff today or tomorrow, one would think. But we're looking to see, because the logistics of this are so complicated, to see if the justices waded into that, or if all of that is going to be something that's now going to be tossed down to lower courts now that the justices have ruled on the larger constitutional question here, the separation sort of powers and who has the authority to do this, right? Because while this has enormous economic implications, really this was a question about the extent of executive power. We know President Trump really plays at the edges of that. And again, this is a rare loss for President Trump since he has returned to office before this conservative court. So we're going to keep waiting through what they said to work out the details.
The dissenters, the loyalists who argued for a nearly boundless view of executive authority in the name of national security, wrote with fire, but they were in the minority. The president's response, documented widely as it spilled across cable news chyrons, was to go nuclear on the court's credibility. He stood at the podium not to discuss the policy implications of the refunding of hundreds of billions of dollars, but to litigate the character and courage of the justices themselves. He didn't use coded language. He didn't hide behind legalistic critiques of the opinion's footnotes. He went straight for the jugular of the institution's dignity. The word ashamed was deployed. Not ashamed of a policy outcome, but ashamed of the human beings wearing the black robes. The epithets fools and lapdogs were unleashed into the political ecosystem, terms that strip away any veneer of respect for the office and reduce the justices to cartoon villains in a personal revenge fantasy. A fool implies a lack of basic intellectual competence. A lapdog implies a total lack of agency, a creature that performs tricks for a hidden master. And to clarify who that hidden master might be, the president lobbed the most explosive accusation in his arsenal: foreign influence. The suggestion that the majority of the Supreme Court was somehow compromised by interests outside the United States, that their legal reasoning was not born of jurisprudence but of some shadowy globalist conspiracy, is the kind of rhetoric that would have been unthinkable from any prior occupant of the office. It is an attack not just on the ruling, but on the very legitimacy of the judicial branch to function as a check. The analysis from across the Atlantic described the moment perfectly. It was a bloody nose. But this was a self-inflicted wound of the ego. The president had bragged for years about reshaping the judiciary. He had made the courts a central selling point of his appeal. To have that monument to his own power turn around and slap him down was more than a legal defeat. It was a humiliation of the highest order. Weeks passed, but the wound refused to scab over. At a gathering of the party's faithful designed to rally the troops and fill campaign coffers, the president veered off the prepared remarks to settle a score that was clearly still festering in his gut. In front of a room full of donors and legislators, he named names. He pointed the finger directly at the two individuals he believed had cost him the game. He framed their vote not as a difference in constitutional interpretation, but as a financial hit job on the American Treasury, and, by extension, on his own political standing. The phrase, "cost us hundreds of billions," is the language of a real estate developer reviewing a balance sheet, not a president respecting a co-equal branch of government. It reveals the core of his misunderstanding of the system. In his mind, the appointment of a judge was an investment. He put up the capital, the nomination, the political fight for confirmation, and he expected a return on that investment, votes in his favor. The idea that these individuals might view their oath to the Constitution as superseding any debt to the man who appointed them is a concept that seems genuinely alien to him. This is the same mindset that fuels his attacks on lower court judges who dare to issue injunctions against his policies. When a district court judge issues a stay, the president reaches for his phone and types out an insult, labeling them wacky or demanding their removal from the bench. It is a consistent, unbroken pattern. The judiciary is not a separate, co-equal branch to be respected. It is a subordinate department to be managed, and when management fails, the employees get a public scolding. But the immediate temper tantrum, as undignified as it was, is merely the surface noise. The real story lies in the structural consequences of the ruling and the president's vowed response to it. Immediately after the decision, the administration signaled its intention to pursue a workaround. The plan, a new sweeping 10% tariff on everything, anchored to a different set of statutory justifications. This is the legal equivalent of trying to pick a different lock on the same door after the first lock was bolted shut. The court's reasoning was not specific to the precise citation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The reasoning was rooted in the fundamental principle that such sweeping, economy-altering decisions require the explicit consent of Congress. Switching the legal citation does not change the underlying constitutional dynamic. The new tariffs will be challenged. The lower courts, bound by the Supreme Court's precedent on the limits of emergency powers, will almost certainly strike them down, and the case will once again climb the marble steps to the High Court. This sets up a perilous game of chicken. What happens when the second loss arrives? What happens when the court says, with even more force and clarity, "No, you cannot do this alone"? The president's own words and actions suggest a man who is not interested in being told no indefinitely. He has already questioned the integrity and intelligence of the justices. He has already insinuated they are puppets of foreign powers. Having delegitimized the referee, the next logical step for a man who refuses to lose is to simply ignore the whistle and play on. This confrontation is not happening in a vacuum. It is running parallel to other high-wire legal battles that will test the very fabric of the separation of powers. The case regarding the unilateral attempt to redefine who is granted citizenship at birth is winding its way through the same judicial pipeline. That case involves the same core question. Can the president, with a stroke of a pen, rewrite a fundamental aspect of American law that has been settled for over a century and is explicitly addressed in the Constitution? The lower courts have already indicated that the answer is no. When that case reaches the Supreme Court, and if the same conservative justices who voted against the tariffs apply the same consistent legal framework to the citizenship question, the president will suffer yet another high-profile defeat on a signature issue. The potential for a second betrayal with the same justices in the majority is the kind of psychological trigger that could push the current rhetorical crisis into a full-blown operational crisis. The president's brand is built on winning. It is built on the perception of strength and the ability to bend institutions to his will. Back-to-back losses at the Supreme Court, delivered by his own appointees, would shatter that perception in a way that no amount of social media bluster can repair. The pressure to do something about an out-of-control judiciary, a judiciary he himself helped build, will become overwhelming. The economic fallout from this legal earthquake is just beginning to settle, and the landscape is treacherous. The ruling doesn't just stop future tariffs. It mandates a massive, multi-billion-dollar refund to the importers who paid those levies. That is a hole in the federal ledger that must be filled. The options are all politically toxic, /popular domestic programs, break a central promise to voters by raising other taxes, or balloon the national debt and hope nobody notices. Furthermore, the business community is now trapped in a state of purgatory. Companies that invested heavily in domestic production facilities banking on the protection of the tariff wall to make their operations competitive are now left holding the bag. They made bets based on a presidential promise that the Supreme Court has just declared unconstitutional. Some of those factories may never open. Others may have to shed the jobs they just created. The economic chaos, the very thing the tariffs were supposedly designed to prevent, is now being fueled by the legal uncertainty of the president's own making. And the political blame for that economic whiplash will be difficult for the administration to deflect, especially when the president is on tape calling the justices who made the ruling fools. For the opposition party, this is a gift that keeps on giving. It provides a narrative spine for the upcoming election cycle that is both simple and devastating. They can argue that the president's signature economic policy was not just bad policy, but illegal policy. They can point to the words of his own Supreme Court appointees as the definitive proof that his actions were lawless. They can frame the election as a choice between a party that respects the rule of law and the constitutional order, and a party led by a man who attacks judges and and calls for their removal when he doesn't get his way. This messaging is particularly potent with the kind of college-educated suburban voters who have been drifting away from the president's coalition. These voters may have supported tax cuts or deregulation, but they are deeply uncomfortable with the raw, personal attacks on the integrity of the judicial system. The spectacle of a sitting president calling a Supreme Court justice a lapdog for foreign powers is the kind of norm-shattering behavior that drives these voters away in droves. The economic populist message that was supposed to solidify the president's hold on the working class is now undercut by the perception of legal incompetence. The question voters will be asked in the midterms is, if he can't even implement his signature promise legally, what else is he failing at? This entire episode lays bare the widening fault lines within the conservative movement itself. The president's coalition is an unstable amalgam of blue-collar nationalists who see tariffs as a shield for American labor, and traditional business interests who see tariffs as a tax on commerce and a disruption to global supply chains. The Supreme Court's ruling has forced that tension out into the open. The legal conservatives on the court, who adhere to a strict reading of the Constitution and the separation of powers, have effectively sided with the Chamber of Commerce wing of the party over the populist wing. The president's response, attacking the justices, is an attempt to rally the populist base against the establishment Republicans in robes. It highlights that the GOP is no longer a unified party with a coherent philosophy of government. It is a vehicle for one man's grievances and impulses, and those impulses are increasingly at war with the foundational principles of the conservative legal movement that helped put him in power. The internal division makes it difficult for the party to mount a cohesive defense of the president's actions. Some will echo his attacks on the court. Others will quietly praise the court's defense of congressional authority. Most will try to say nothing at all, hoping the storm passes. But silence is not a strategy, and in the face of an ongoing constitutional showdown, the fractures within the party will only become more pronounced. This moment also injects a powerful new charge into the ongoing discussions of accountability and removal on Capitol Hill. Those pushing for impeachment already have a long list of grievances: the defiance of court orders, the attacks on individual judges, the consolidation of power. The tariff ruling provides the gold standard piece of evidence for the argument that this president routinely and knowingly exceeds his constitutional authority. When the Supreme Court, by a 6-3 margin including his own appointees, declares that a major executive action is illegal, it validates the central thesis of the impeachment drive, that this is a man who does not believe the rules apply to him. The ruling provides a clean, nonpartisan hook. It's not just Democrats saying he overreached, it's the Supreme Court of the United States. If the midterm elections shift the balance of power in Congress, the road to formal accountability becomes much shorter and much steeper for the administration. The tariff case will be cited in impeachment articles not as a single bad act, but as the most glaring example of a persistent pattern of lawlessness. Let us pull the threads together and assess the full weight of this moment. The president's reaction to the tariff ruling is a window into his soul and a preview of the crisis to come. First, the nature of his attack, calling justices fools, lapdogs, and tools of foreign influence, is a qualitative escalation in the war on institutions. It is designed to delegitimize the only branch of government capable of saying no to him with finality. Second, the vow to impose new tariffs under a different legal theory is a setup for a sequel. It guarantees another round of litigation that will end up right back in the same courtroom with the same justices and likely the same outcome. This is the path to a constitutional crisis where the executive branch simply refuses to accept judicial supremacy. Third, the economic damage is multifaceted. The refund liability, the business uncertainty, and the undermining of the president's populist economic brand all weaken his political standing heading into a critical election year. Fourth, this is an unexpected gift to the opposition. It provides a clear, compelling, and legally sound argument that the president is an outlaw who attacks the referees when he loses. Fifth, it deepens the ideological civil war inside his own party, pitting populist loyalists against constitutional conservatives who believe in the structural limits of power. The bottom line is this: The Supreme Court, wielding a doctrine designed to protect the power of the people's representatives, delivered a devastating blow to the president's trade agenda. The president, in turn, delivered a devastating blow to the norms of judicial respect. He attacked the courage and integrity of the very people he placed on the bench, quantifying their betrayal in terms of lost revenue and political capital. He accused them, without a shred of evidence, of being compromised by foreign actors. This is not a dispute over policy nuance. It is an assault on the foundation of an independent judiciary. As the birthright citizenship case and the new tariff proposal wind their way toward the same court, the nation is on a collision course with a fundamental question. Can a system built on checks and balances survive a president who views every check as an act of war? The court has shown it is willing to use the leash. The president's fury suggests he is contemplating chewing through it. We will be watching every development in this legal and political firestorm because the fate of the American experiment hangs on whether the law remains stronger than the man who seeks to break it.